Picture this: a quiet medieval night, flickering candlelight, and a healer whispering prayers while mixing henbane, mandrake, and pig fat into a thick balm. She gently applies it to your skin, and suddenly the world tilts. You're floating, not walking, through the darkness, half dreaming, half awake. Was it magic, medicine, or madness? Tonight, we uncover what getting high was like during the medieval times, and the haunting line between healing and hallucination. Imagine waking up in the Middle Ages. The day starts early, much earlier than you'd like. There's no respite from the grind, fields to tend, livestock to mind, or if you're unlucky, some castle's kitchen to scrub down. Nights aren't much better. The hum of crickets might help you doze off, but the cold could keep you half awake. And if you're in a village, well, privacy isn't much of a thing. It's the kind of life where distractions are scarce, except the occasional festival or visiting peddler. Now, you might think, what did people do to get through it all? Turns out, they weren't all about quiet endurance. They had their own ways of escaping the monotony. And trust me, it wasn't always about prayer. Medieval folks weren't so different from us when it came to wanting a break from reality. But where you'd reach for your phone or stream a series, they'd turn to the natural world around them. Plants, mostly. Some brewed into teas, others steeped in oils or burnt as incense. A chunk of rye bread or a splash of alcohol could also do the trick, though not always in the way people planned. These weren't just household remedies. They were ingredients in a concoction that blurred the lines between survival, ritual, and something far closer to psychedelics than you'd expect. Let's be clear. When people experimented with these substances, it wasn't purely for fun. For many, it was about necessity, medicine, or even reaching the divine. Herbs like henbane, for example, weren't just lying around for the picking. They were important tools. Take pain relief. If you had a broken bone or even something as minor as a toothache, you didn't exactly have many options. Henbane, with its anesthetic qualities, was a popular solution, though it came with a terrifying side effect if the dose was wrong. Hallucinations that could send someone thinking they were swimming through pink fog or galloping across fields like a horse. And yet, this same plant wasn't always associated with trepidation. Healers treated it like a normal part of their toolkit. Past the realm of medicine, though, things got more interesting. It wasn't uncommon for substances to serve dual purposes, curing ailments for one person while sending someone else into a trance or an out-of-body experience. Sure, laughter would come later when that person claimed they saw angels in the village square. But at the time, it probably felt very real. Now, you can't talk about escaping reality in the Middle Ages without mentioning beer. Not the golden, fizzy drink you'd recognize today, though. It was thicker, murkier, and often safer to drink than the water. For many, beer was a basic part of the diet, providing calories and hydration. But add a few extra rounds and, well, you could forget about your worries for a while. Alcohol wasn't seen as sinful per se. It appeared at celebrations and even within monasteries, where monks brewed some of the best stuff around. Yet drunkenness was frowned upon in certain contexts, which added an undercurrent of social tension to drinking culture. You had to toe the line between acceptable relaxation and overindulgence, something that didn't always go smoothly. Of course, there were moments when even trying to relax came with complications, say, eating bread. In certain regions where rye was common, entire harvests could be tainted by something called ergot. This parasitic fungus hijacked the grain, and when consumed, it had hallucinogenic effects that could be mild or outright horrifying. People would experience convulsions, burning sensations in their limbs, and surreal visions, turning a loaf of bread into a not-so-pleasant trip. Some outbreaks were so severe they led to dancing plagues, where whole communities were overcome with compulsive movements and odd behavior for days, sometimes weeks, on end. Imagine watching your neighbors lose themselves entirely, unable to stop. To those who witnessed it, the scene wasn't scientific. It was merely divine wrath or a curse. Adding to this mix of unpredictability was the role of religion. You'd think the church would have slammed the door shut on anything beyond prayer, but the reality was more complicated. Yes, the use of certain substances and the potential for altered states could be seen as witchcraft in some cases, particularly when tied to women or folk healing. But that didn't stop clergy members and mystics from experimenting. Long fasting rituals, combined with the heavy use of incense like frankincense during service, created an atmosphere that was physically and spiritually intoxicating. Frankincense isn't just aromatic, it contains compounds that can affect mood and soothe the mind. While no one's claiming this led to hallucinations, its effects likely heightened the feelings of release and connection during long sermons or prayers. Even the church's approach to wine highlights these contradictions. The sacrament of communion depended on wine as a symbol of Christ's blood, which elevated the drink to something sacred. Yet the same cup that nourished the soul could also loosen tongues, or result in behavior that the church didn't exactly condone, like the occasional brawl after a poorly paced feast. How people viewed altered states and their causes often came down to class, gender, and intent. Saints and mystics were celebrated for their visions, framed as divine experiences. Meanwhile, peasants or healers experiencing similar sensations were far more likely to get accused of dabbling in witchcraft or invoking the devil. The difference wasn't what they saw. It was about who they were and how the community framed it. Even healers using plants for practical medical reasons risked being labeled dangerous if others deemed their skills too mysterious. And heaven help if the same plants fell into the hands of someone accused of heresy. And yet, who could resist? With life as grueling as it was, taking a risk on a little henbane tea or a mysterious ointment wasn't just tempting, it was survival, whether from physical pain, emotional hardship, or the sheer crushing predictability of life. When days looked the same, week after week, year after year, people sought out symbols, comforts, and sometimes outright chaos for a change of pace. Everything from plants to bread could carry the potential for release or disaster, depending on how it was prepared, who gave it to you, and maybe just how lucky or unlucky you were that day. For those in medieval Europe, substances weren't just things you encountered in isolation. They were part of a broader ecosystem of belief, knowledge, and fear. Some experiments with these substances were deeply tied to rituals like fertility or harvest celebrations, offering both individual clarity and communal unity. At the same time, cultural divides loomed large. The wealthy ate more refined foods or consumed larger amounts of alcohol, without the same concerns plaguing peasants. Access to trained healers or better quality resources mattered too, providing one group with advantages in safety while others faced far greater risks. All of this set the stage for a culture where the same balm could cure or scare, where the same smoke could anoint a saint or damn a stranger. Relationships with substances weren't defined merely by how they worked, but by centuries of interpretations layered over their use. And while these interpretations sometimes punished curiosity, there was always an undercurrent that acknowledged it was near impossible to separate nature's gifts plants, herbs, or even a good glass of ale from the chaotic, unpredictable human experience. So, what did this look like up close? What plants, potions, and peculiar concoctions became the tools of escapism for a medieval mind? Well, the answer might lie in the specifics. Individual substances so powerful and mysterious that they left their mark not only on history, but also on myth and legend. Which ones worked, and which ones delivered more curse than cure? Let's find out. What if the same plant that helped ease your aches and pains also had you convinced you were a bird, flapping your arms and squawking as you ran through the village square? Welcome to the world of henbane, one of the Middle Ages' most fascinating and feared plants. This wasn't just some weed growing at the edge of a field. Henbane was a cornerstone of medieval medicine, yet it came with a serious warning label. Though, let's be real, medieval people didn't have warning labels. They had trial and error, or, more accurately, a lot of error. In its simplest, most carefully controlled form, henbane was a godsend. Healers used it to numb pain or soothe an upset stomach. Think toothaches, broken bones, or even childbirth. Times when you desperately needed something to take the edge off, but you didn't have much in the way of options. Henbane, when prepared as a tea, could do the trick, quieting pain and relaxing the mind. But while a small amount might make you feel like you could get through the day, a little too much could send you spiraling into a completely different reality. And by a little, I mean a very fine line. This plant didn't leave much room for error. One person's sedative was another's hallucinogenic nightmare. Now, let's talk preparation, because this wasn't a plant you could just grab and hope for the best. Teas were common, but henbane could also be turned into ointments, smoked, or even inhaled through steam. Healers combined it with fats or oils, letting the body absorb its effects slowly through the skin. This method was often used to treat localized pain, but it also had a reputation for sending people somewhere different. Smoking henbane, on the other hand, delivered its effects almost instantly. The dried leaves would be tossed into a fire, and those who inhaled its smoke reported a range of experiences, from feeling weightless to seeing otherworldly visions. That might sound enchanting, but the problem came when those effects turned stronger than expected. Imagine sipping a tea meant to calm your nerves, only to wake up hours later in the woods, wondering why you're barefoot and covered in scratches. What caused this reality-bending unpredictability? The science behind it lies in two active compounds found in henbane, scopolamine and hyoscyamine. These chemicals, naturally occurring in the plant, affect the nervous system by blocking certain neurotransmitters. Small doses might relax your muscles or relieve pain, but higher amounts could disrupt how your brain processes reality. Scopolamine, in particular, is known for its potent hallucinogenic effects, which can make the world around you feel alien or terrifyingly surreal. This is what made henbane so tricky to administer. Even trained healers had to experiment with dosages, and medieval pharmacology wasn't exactly standardized. Would this batch lead to peaceful dreams? Or have you seen visions of winged creatures flying through your room? Nobody knew for sure, and that uncertainty shaped how people viewed henbane. For some, henbane's effects were downright mystical. Tales of visions and prophecies popped up in folk stories, with individuals swearing they'd seen angels or glimpsed the future. But those miraculous moments were often overshadowed by more chaotic ones. Take the person who, convinced they'd turned into a duck, ran through the village pond splashing wildly, or another who broke out in screams, claiming their body was on fire. Not exactly what you'd hope for when you just wanted some relief from a sore back. These unpredictable outcomes weren't just amusing anecdotes, they had consequences. Communities began to associate the plant with dark forces, viewing its unpredictable effects as a sign of something unnatural, even demonic. And of course, the church had its own thoughts on the matter. Henbane's ability to blur the lines between reality and hallucination made it a plant fit for suspicion. If you experienced something divine, like the aforementioned angelic visions, there was a chance your community would see you as blessed, maybe even a saint. But, and this was the catch, if those visions veered into the bizarre or unpleasant, you were more likely to be labeled bewitched, or worse, a witch. So much of it came down to perception. Use henbane the right way, and it was medicine. Use it the wrong way, and suddenly you were in league with the devil. This connection to witchcraft wasn't just paranoia either. Henbane played a notable role in the infamous flying ointments associated with medieval witches. According to legend and some scattered historical accounts, these ointments were rubbed on the skin to induce hallucinatory experiences, convincing the user they had literally taken flight. Some sources claim the ointments were applied to a broomstick, which was then used to ride to far-off places. Now, whether or not anyone actually believed they were flying is up for debate, but the physical effects of the ointments, especially when absorbed through certain areas of the body, were very real. Delusions, a spiraling sense of euphoria, and intense visions all tied back to plants like henbane. And believe me, this didn't help its case with the church. The unpredictability of henbane's effects meant it wasn't just a gamble for individuals. Entire communities could be affected, especially when these substances were used during rituals or celebrations. There are stories of villagers trying henbane-laced beverages at festivals, only to have things spiral into chaos. A supposedly merry gathering could turn into a scene of wild paranoia, with people claiming they were chased by invisible creatures, or feeling their bodies transforming. These weren't isolated incidents either. Accounts of communal hallucinations or mass hysteria spread across medieval Europe, often tied back to plants like henbane. And yet, despite all this chaos, or maybe because of it, the plant remained in use, trusted by some as much as it was feared by others. The line between cure and curse with henbane was razor thin. Get the dosage just right, and you had a remedy to make even the harshest medieval life bearable. But one misstep, one slight miscalculation, and you could find yourself at the mercy of its darker side. Hallucinations, screaming fits, paranoia. This was the other side of the coin for those bold enough, or desperate enough, to use it. For healers, it must have felt like walking a tightrope every time they reached for a dried leaf or a jar of henbane-infused oil. The stakes weren't just about efficacy. They were about survival, not just for the patient, but for the healer's reputation in a society all too ready to cry witchcraft. Even today, henbane's reputation lingers. Modern science explains its effects with clear chemical facts, but the lore surrounding it hasn't disappeared. It remains a reminder of how closely medieval people lived to nature, and how much of a gamble it could be to rely on that same nature when things went wrong. Looking back, it's no wonder henbane was both revered and feared. It held power in its roots and leaves, power that could heal or harm. But henbane wasn't the only plant with such a reputation. Another root, tangled in eerie folklore and infamous for its striking appearance, would put henbane's notoriety to the test. Mandrake, with its strange, human-like shape, was bursting with its own mix of mystery, power, and danger. It's said that pulling it from the ground could come with deadly consequences. Let's see just what made this uncanny root so legendary. What kind of plant could strike fear into the hearts of medieval people and spark rumors of deadly screams when pulled from the ground? Meet the mandrake. This strange, gnarled root doesn't look like much at first glance, until you notice its eerie, human-like shape. Thick arms, spindly legs, and a bulbous head-like growth made it resemble a tiny figure buried in the earth. But it wasn't just its uncanny appearance that gave the mandrake its reputation. In folk tales and the imagination of the Middle Ages, it gained a mystique that blurred the lines between medicine, magic, and outright terror. The most famous and bizarre story surrounding this root was its harvest. You couldn't just yank it out of the ground like a carrot. Oh no, the mandrake was far too dangerous for that. According to legend, pulling it up could have deadly consequences. The plant was said to emit a bone-chilling scream so powerful that anyone who heard it would instantly drop dead. Stories about people collapsing after attempting to harvest mandrake spread fear like wildfire. Whether the scream was real or imagined, medieval people took precautions. Folklore suggested tying a rope around the mandrake's base and attaching the other end to an animal, usually a dog. You'd cover your ears and let the animal do the dirty work, sacrificing it to draw out the roots safely. Of course, that grim workaround only added to the mandrake's terrifying reputation. Now, why bother with something that came with such ominous baggage? What made the mandrake worth the risk? For one, it wasn't just a creepy root. It was believed to have incredible powers. In the world of medieval medicine, the mandrake was practically a celebrity. Its roots, when prepared properly, were thought to work as an anesthetic. Surgeons, if you could call them that back then, sometimes soaked pieces of mandrake in wine to create a rudimentary potion. Patients who drank it would fall into a deep sleep-like state, making painful surgeries slightly less excruciating, or at least more bearable than staying awake. Think of it as medieval anesthesia, albeit wildly unreliable. But mandrake use wasn't limited to the sick room. Its connection to fertility rituals and magic gave it a place in mystical practices as well. The root's vaguely human form led people to believe it had a special connection to life itself. Some thought carrying mandrake could increase fertility in women, or act as a charm to ensure healthy childbirth. Naturally, this made the root highly sought after by those struggling to conceive, though it's unlikely anyone who used mandrake in this way found much scientific success. Still, in a time when hope was often all people had, these beliefs gave comfort and purpose to a plant that clearly played on their imaginations. Mystics and seers, on the other hand, had their own reasons for seeking out mandrake. It was believed to be a gateway to the divine, capable of stirring prophetic dreams and visions. Consuming mandrake in carefully measured doses, usually as a decoction or extract, could supposedly bring on an intense, trance-like state. Those who took it often described sensations of floating or being separated from their bodies. For mystics, this wasn't just a drug trip. It was a way to glimpse other realms, to step beyond the veil of reality and tap into hidden truths. The church wasn't exactly thrilled with these practices, of course, but that didn't stop people from trying to use the root to unlock what they saw as spiritual enlightenment. As intriguing as this all sounds, the effects of mandrake weren't exactly universally celebratory. Its active compounds, scopolamine, similar to henbane, along with atropine, were powerful but incredibly unpredictable. In small amounts, the plant could relax you, acting as a sedative, but anything beyond the mildest of doses could send your body into turmoil. Hallucinations were a common side effect, and not the pleasant kind where you might see fields of light or angelic figures. We're talking grotesque imagery and warped perceptions, the sort that made people wake up sweating or convinced they'd been dragged through nightmares. But that wasn't the worst of it. Without proper preparation, ingesting mandrake could induce vomiting, dizziness, or even put someone into a coma. It didn't take much for a risky experiment to turn into a deadly mistake. For those determined to use mandrake anyway, preparation was key. Roots were usually dried and ground into powders, or steeped in solvents like oil, alcohol, or vinegar to extract their chemical properties. These preparations were applied topically, or ingested in small, carefully measured quantities. But careful is a relative word here. This was medieval medicine, after all, and standard measurements weren't exactly on the radar. If someone's idea of a small dose turned out to be too liberal with the powdered root, the patient, or unwitting participant, could find themselves dangerously overwhelmed. The mandrake's reputation wasn't just built on its potential to induce visions or its capacity as a sedative. Its associations with magic and witchcraft cemented its place in medieval culture. For the people who feared it, mandrake wasn't just a plant. It was a tool of dark forces. Stories circulated about witches using the root in spells, especially for creating flying ointments, alongside other infamous ingredients like henbane and belladonna. The ointments allegedly allowed their users to experience hallucinations so vivid they believed they were taking flight. Whether or not this was ever true, the mere idea that these roots granted such power made them objects of both fascination and suspicion. Even its harvest added to the mandrake's forbidden allure. The scream stories only grew with time, and while there's no historical evidence to back up these tales, the sheer fact that people believed them created a culture of fear around the plant. The reality was far less theatrical. Most likely, the mandrake's roots simply looked unsettling enough to inspire dread in a superstitious era. But once a few chilling stories made the rounds, the plant's menacing legend took on a life of its own. For all the suspicion, some people saw the mandrake's power in a more balanced light. The root wasn't purely dangerous. It was miraculous too, a symbol that nature could hold both poison and magic in the same vessel. It bridged life and death, medicine and mysticism, making it a plant that could seemingly do it all. But that duality is exactly why it was treated with such reverence and fear. It wasn't something you casually pulled from your garden or tossed into a stew. Mandrakes were treated with ritual care, collected for specific purposes, and only handled by those who could afford to know better, or were desperate enough not to care. In some ways, the mandrake was a reflection of medieval life itself. Unstable, unpredictable, and full of contrasts. It could heal you, or kill you. It carried promises of mystical insight, but could douse your mind in nightmares just as easily. The same folklore that told stories of death by scream also suggested that mandrakes could bring good fortune if handled correctly. That balance of risk and reward made it impossible to look at a mandrake without a mix of awe and unease. And yet, its story didn't end in the Middle Ages. The mandrake continued to hold sway over imaginations for centuries, featured in everything from Renaissance alchemy recipes to modern fantasy novels. Its legacy as a root of peril and possibility feels like a relic of a world that both depended on and feared the wild unpredictability of nature. But mandrake wasn't alone in its ability to blur the line between help and harm. There was another plant equally rooted in fear and fascination, one whose very name hinted at danger but also promise beauty. Deadly nightshade, or belladonna, may have an even darker reputation than mandrake, and like its counterpart, it carried both practical uses and mystical connotations. Let's dive into that next. Imagine looking into a medieval mirror, probably some polished metal, not glass, and deciding your reflection could use a little extra sparkle. If you were ambitious, or perhaps vain, you might dab a strange, murky liquid into your eyes. Moments later, your pupils would widen, giving you that deep, mysterious stare poets wrote about. It was beautiful, deadly too. That liquid likely came from belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, a plant as enchanting as it was dangerous. The name belladonna itself means beautiful lady, hinting at the cosmetic use that made it infamous. But don't be fooled by its glamorous reputation. This wasn't some medieval makeup hack you could mess around with casually. Belladonna's charm came with a heavy dose of danger. People used it sparingly to dilate their pupils, giving them an alluring look. Back then, wide eyes were a sign of beauty or even purity, something society obsessed over. The problem, though, was that belladonna wasn't just stretching the boundaries of aesthetics. It was actively interfering with the nervous system. And while it might have improved appearances in a dim, candlelit room, no one was reading the fine print on what too much exposure could mean. Blurred vision, dizziness, and, in higher doses, hallucinations. They weren't just the side effects, they were almost guaranteed. It wasn't only about beauty, though. Belladonna, like henbane and mandrake, had its place in medieval medicine. As with most plants in the nightshade family, small amounts had anesthetic properties, making it useful for treating pain or relaxing muscle spasms. Healers turned its leaves and berries into tinctures or ointments, using them to soothe ailments that had few, if any, other remedies. Imagine having an unbearable stomachache from spoiled food, or a fever so high it made you think the devil himself was warming the room. That's when belladonna's medicinal prowess came into play. It could calm those twisted muscles, or bring your pulse down from a frenzy, all while teetering dangerously close to poisoning you. But here's where belladonna got complicated. Its benefits and risks weren't easy to separate. The plant contained powerful alkaloids, mostly atropine, which impacted how the body functioned. Atropine blocked chemical signals in your nervous system, which, depending on the dose, either helped or completely short-circuited your body. Moderation wasn't just a suggestion. It was the difference between recovery and being, well, completely out of commission. Healing someone with belladonna required precision, which isn't exactly what medieval medicine was famous for. Combine a lack of measurements with a culture prone to superstition, and belladonna transformed from a useful plant into something straight out of a nightmare. Speaking of nightmares, belladonna's hallucinogenic properties earned it a reputation in magical and ritualistic practices as well. Like henbane and mandrake, it was a star ingredient in the legendary flying ointments supposedly used by witches. These ointments were said to bring on vivid, otherworldly hallucinations, so vivid, in fact, that users believed they were soaring through the air. Applied to the skin, often on particularly sensitive areas for quicker absorption, belladonna unleashed its effects slowly and intensely. While the church loudly declared these experiences as evidence of witchcraft, what was likely happening was closer to an unwitting psychedelic trip than any actual broomstick flight. To complicate things further, belladonna wasn't solely confined to shadowy practitioners or whispered about rituals. Its uses extended into religious and mystical ceremonies too. Some communities believed that small doses could help visionaries or mystics connect with divine forces. After all, if the plant could blur reality, creating visions, wouldn't it also serve as a spiritual tool? Those visions, though, chaotic, surreal, and entirely unpredictable, tended to cause more confusion than clarity, which made the church wary of anyone who experimented with such substances. But even beyond the religious or magical, belladonna had a way of finding its way into strange corners of life. One often overlooked use was acting as a poison. Yes, belladonna's inherent danger wasn't all accidental. Whether intentionally or by horrific mistake, its berries and leaves were consumed in dangerous amounts, leading to terrifying symptoms. Picture sweating profusely, your heart racing, and your limbs moving as if they had a mind of their own. All classic signs of atropine poisoning. This wasn't the kind of drama people sought, even in an age where life itself felt precarious on a daily basis. Despite these risks, belladonna was still highly sought after, particularly by those who believed its dangers were worth the reward. Beauty rituals, pain remedies, spiritual journeys. It promised all that and more, even if it often failed to deliver. Its allure was hard to measure against its reputation, which leaned heavily into the forbidden and mysterious. One reason for that was its association with death. Belladonna wasn't called deadly nightshade for nothing. It could stop a heart or plunge someone into a fatal coma, a fact that made it a favored tool in more sinister scenarios. You didn't have to use much. Just a misplaced berry or two could cause enough mayhem to make the plant a weapon as much as a medicine. The plant's association with witchcraft only intensified these fears during medieval witch hunts. Authorities often looked for evidence like dried belladonna leaves or ointments as proof of dark practices. Because let's face it, if your innocent healing herb can simultaneously numb pain and send someone into a hallucinatory stupor, people are going to decide it's cursed sooner or later. All it took was one case of poor dosing or a bizarre side effect to spark paranoia. Even healers with good intentions could find themselves branded as dangerous, especially if their belladonna treatments went awry. By the late Middle Ages, belladonna was tangled in a web of rumors, misconceptions, and wild truths. Some swore by its beauty-enhancing powers or its ability to cure the uncurable. Others avoided it altogether, convinced it brought only trouble. Either way, its impact on medieval life was undeniable. Whether it was adding a touch of enchantment to someone's gaze, or making them believe they'd met their guardian angel in a fit of hallucinations, belladonna had more influence on the body and mind than most dared to admit. But belladonna wasn't an invincible plant. Its effects only lasted as long as it was prepared with care. Poor storage or improper handling could render it useless, or worse, deadly before anyone realized the mistake. And like all plants linked to mysticism or the supernatural, its power wavered in the face of evolving scientific principles. What once seemed like magic started being labeled as chemistry, though the plant's darker legacy remained far from forgotten. For medieval people, though, the line between cure and chaos was always paper-thin. Plants like belladonna existed in a grey area, neither fully savior nor fully villain, just part of the unpredictable natural world they relied on to survive. And for all its risks, belladonna was proof that even the smallest, simplest piece of nature could wield incredible power. With belladonna behind us, there's another type of plant-adjacent danger to consider. This one didn't stem from intentional use, but from complete accident. What happens when your daily food, your most basic, trusted comfort, ends up working against you in the most unexpected way. Picture this. You make a loaf of bread, but start seeing things that aren't there, yourself included. That's not just bad luck. It's ergot, a parasitic fungus that could send entire villages into swirling chaos. Let's look at how something as harmless as bread turned into one of the Middle Ages' strangest unintended trips. Picture this. Your morning begins with a slice of rye bread, the same as always. It's dense, not particularly fresh, but enough to get you through the day ahead. By mid-afternoon, though, things start to feel strange. Your fingers tingle, your legs twitch, and before you know it, you can't stop moving. Around you, neighbors are succumbing to similar fits, spinning and gyrating in ways that look almost joyful, but their faces tell a different story. Panic, confusion, even terror. Welcome to the bizarre world of ergot poisoning, where a humble loaf of bread could turn life into a waking nightmare. The culprit, ergot, a parasitic fungus that thrived on damp rye crops. Rye was a staple for much of the medieval population, especially for poorer communities that relied on it as their primary grain. But when warm, wet conditions took hold during a growing season, the harvest could become contaminated with this fungus. At first glance, ergot-infected rye didn't look all that different from the usual grain. Sure, it was a little darker, maybe misshapen. But in an era where food shortages were common, nobody was about to toss out a batch of bread over a few odd-looking seeds. And so, entire villages would unknowingly ingest this fungal hitchhiker, setting the stage for chaos. Ergot contains alkaloids, particularly ergotamine and lysergic acid derivatives. If that second one sounds familiar, it's because it's chemically related to LSD. Yes, medieval peasants were accidentally dosing themselves with a proto-hallucinogen, though probably not the kind of high anyone would want. Ergot's effects weren't limited to visual illusions or dreamy sensations. It was more like your body turning against you. One common symptom was convulsions, where muscles would seize uncontrollably. These were often accompanied by intense burning sensations, as if your skin were on fire. Hence the nickname St. Anthony's Fire. It didn't stop there. Victims sometimes experienced vivid hallucinations, losing their grip on reality entirely. These ranged from seeing divine visions to encountering nightmarish creatures no one else could see. All this from an unsuspecting piece of bread. And then there were the episodes we now call dancing plagues, events where entire communities seemed to fall into a trance, unable to stop moving. The most infamous outbreak occurred in Strasbourg in 1518, when dozens of people began dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Accounts describe them flailing and leaping, some crying out in agony while others seemed locked in a manic state of euphoria. This wasn't a spontaneous medieval dance-off. People danced until their feet bled, some even collapsing or dying from exhaustion. While not all experts agreed that ergot was the sole cause of such events, stress and mass psychogenic illness likely played a role. It's hard to ignore how perfectly ergot poisoning fits the symptoms. But this wasn't a one-time event. Earlier records hint at similar outbreaks, like one in 1374 that swept through towns along the Rhine River. Chroniclers describe victims moving as if possessed, with some shouting incoherently or claiming to see otherworldly visions. In an age where science and superstition often collided, it's no surprise that these events were interpreted through a spiritual lens. Was God punishing these communities? Or had they fallen under a curse, perhaps brought on by an angry witch? People searched for explanations, but lacking any understanding of fungal biology, they were left to blame the supernatural. The spiritual interpretation wasn't entirely misplaced. After all, those who suffered often reported seeing religious imagery during their hallucinations. Saints, angels, even glimpses of heaven or hell. This only deepened the belief that something divine or demonic was at work. And when it wasn't visions of the afterlife, it was something far darker. Apparitions of death, strange creatures stalking the landscape, or loved ones appearing grotesque and distorted. Imagine how terrifying it must have been for someone living in an already precarious world, where every event carried spiritual weight. A bad dream could feel like an omen. A full-blown hallucination might cement your belief that you were in the middle of a moral reckoning. For those desperate to help, or perhaps just to contain the chaos, the Order of St. Anthony became a lifeline. This religious group specialized in caring for victims of ergotism, establishing hospitals dedicated to treating what was then called St. Anthony's fire. They didn't know the cause, of course, but their treatments often revolved around soothing the burning pain and calming the convulsions. Pilgrims would flock to these sanctuaries, seeking not only medical relief, but also spiritual intervention. Relics of St. Anthony were believed to protect against disease, and many prayed for miraculous cures while undergoing care. To this day, the Order's connection to the disease remains a testament to how deeply intertwined faith and medicine were in the medieval mindset. But while authorities and healers tried to manage the symptoms, outbreaks of ergot poisoning and the dancing episodes they could trigger remained largely unpredictable. Rye bread was an everyday staple, eaten without much thought. Few understood the potential danger lurking in their food. Over time, though, people began to notice that certain harvests or regions were more prone to the illness. This eventually led to better grain storage practices and, later, techniques for separating infected seeds. However, these improvements took centuries to take hold, and in the meantime, ergot continued to wreak havoc on unsuspecting communities. Looking at it from today's perspective, ergot's effects bear an eerie resemblance to modern psychedelics. Its hallucinogenic properties, derived from the same chemical family as LSD, raise interesting questions about the accidental role it may have played in altering perceptions during the Middle Ages. While ergotism was undoubtedly a horrific experience for most, it's possible that some of its milder effects, dreamlike visions or moments of altered consciousness, contributed to the era's spiritual and artistic culture. After all, medieval art is filled with surreal, often otherworldly imagery. Could ergot have amplified imaginations in unexpected ways? It's speculation, of course, but an intriguing idea nonetheless. Still, ergot was far more curse than curiosity. Its outbreaks were brutal reminders of how fragile survival was in the Middle Ages. At a time when food security was already precarious, ergot-infested rye added yet another layer of unpredictability. That loaf of bread, so central to life, could just as easily bring suffering or death. And because there was no definitive way to identify contaminated grain before it was consumed, preventing ergot poisoning came down to sheer luck, or divine mercy, as many saw it. For all the fear and pain ergot brought, it also serves as an example of how humans have always been vulnerable to the unseen forces of the natural world. The medieval view of ergot poisoning often placed it in the realm of punishment or magic, but today we know it was simply a microscopic invasion of fungi into a food source. And yet, even that scientific explanation doesn't erase the almost supernatural quality of its effects. It wasn't just a physical illness, it transformed behavior, perception, and even community dynamics. Entire towns could be pulled into the same chaotic rhythm, moving together as though controlled by something they couldn't see. Ergot poisoning is a powerful reminder of how thin the line was between survival and disaster in the Middle Ages. A single fungus was enough to upend entire villages, blurring reality and redefining what it meant to lose control. From terrifying visions to uncontrollable movements, it held its victims in a grip that seemed almost otherworldly, and in a sense it was. A natural toxin creating effects that felt anything but natural to those who experienced them. But ergot wasn't the only natural force capable of wreaking havoc in unexpected ways. Imagine stumbling across something sweet, something as seemingly harmless as honey, only to find yourself reeling from its effects hours later. This wasn't the work of fungi this time, but bees, unknowingly creating a substance that could heal you or incapacitate you completely. Welcome to the strange, dangerous world of mad honey, an entirely different kind of accidental high. Let's get into that. What if the same honey you drizzled into your tea could have you giggling uncontrollably one moment and curled up with stomach pains the next? That's exactly the tightrope walked by something called mad honey, a strange and rare substance carefully harvested in the mountains of Anatolia. At first glance, it doesn't look much different from the honey in your kitchen, glossy, golden, and sweet. But make no mistake, this isn't your average jar of nature's sugar fix. In the right doses, mad honey could be a medicine. In the wrong ones, it could put you on your back, or worse. What makes mad honey so unusual is where it comes from. In the rugged terrain of modern-day Turkey, high-altitude rhododendron plants produced nectar laced with something far more potent than sugar, grayanotoxins. These compounds don't just sweeten the honey, they turn it into something entirely different. When consumed, grayanotoxins mess with your body's electrical signals, slowing your heart rate, dropping your blood pressure, and sometimes throwing in some unexpected side effects like dizziness or euphoria. If it sounds like a trip, that's because for some, it practically was. For centuries, locals in this region knew exactly what they were dealing with and how to handle it. Mad honey wasn't an everyday treat. Consuming it in large amounts was a recipe for disaster, but small doses. That was a different story. Carefully rationed, it was used as a kind of medicine long before pharmacies and aspirin became mainstream. Headaches, stomach issues, and joint pain. People swore by mad honey's ability to ease these ailments. And it wasn't just folk remedies or a hunch. The honey's effects on blood pressure made it a useful, albeit risky, treatment for certain cardiovascular problems. Imagine trying to balance the benefits of mild relaxation and pain relief with the risk of losing control entirely. That was the gamble with mad honey, and for those who got it right, it seemed worth the risk. But not everyone approached it with such measured caution. In fact, mad honey's potent effects weren't limited to medicine or mild experimentation. Sometimes they were weaponized. Take a story from classical antiquity, when the Greek writer Xenophon recounted a moment during his army's retreat through Turkey in 401 BCE. Starving soldiers stumbled upon hives in the region and, without realizing what they were getting into, helped themselves to the strange, intoxicating honey. At first, they probably thought they'd hit the jackpot, a free buffet courtesy of nature. But the celebration didn't last. Within hours, they were stumbling, puking, and collapsing into a disoriented mess. These hardened warriors, battle-tested and tough, had been completely incapacitated by a few spoonfuls of the wrong honey. According to the accounts, it took days for them to recover. Interestingly, some armies used this honey intentionally to weaken their enemies. In 67 BCE, Roman soldiers under Pompey the Great's command reportedly fell victim to a trap. While fighting a local tribe in northeastern Turkey, their opponents left combs of mad honey along the paths Pompey's troops were following. Hungry and unsuspecting, the Romans feasted on the honey, only to be struck down by its effects shortly after. The locals didn't wait long before launching their attack, easily dispatching the Roman soldiers who were too delirious and confused to resist. It's one of history's strangest military traps, and it worked, not because of swords or spears, but because of bees. For the locals who lived in mad honey-producing regions, though, this wasn't just a hazardous novelty. It was part of their lives. Generations of beekeepers learned how to harvest the honey carefully, knowing its dangers and its uses alike. They understood that the key to using mad honey safely was all about moderation. Even today, small amounts of it are sold for medicinal and traditional purposes, though it's treated with great respect. This wasn't the kind of honey you spread generously on toast or stirred into a giant mug of tea. It was more like a carefully measured tincture, one small spoonful, and absolutely no second servings. Mad honey's connection to medicine wasn't purely practical, though. It had an air of mysticism about it too, particularly in folk healing traditions. Shamans and healers who worked in these regions sometimes used mad honey as part of ceremonies meant to cleanse the body or clarify the mind. Given its ability to induce euphoria or hallucinations at certain doses, it's easy to see why it was linked to spiritual practices. Consuming mad honey could feel like stepping briefly out of normal consciousness, something that made it especially intriguing in cultures that valued altered states for religious or healing purposes. Of course, all this came with risks. The difference between a medicinal dose and a dangerous one was razor thin. For those who didn't respect the plant or its limits, the consequences could be brutal. Nausea, vomiting, dangerously low heart rates, and even temporary paralysis. It's worth mentioning that while mad honey could knock out an unwitting eater for hours, fatalities were fairly rare. The body often managed to flush the toxin out on its own, though the experience was anything but pleasant. Still, for someone who didn't know what they'd eaten or didn't recognize the symptoms of mad honey poisoning, the ordeal must have felt terrifying. Imagine eating something you thought was harmless, only to find yourself chest deep in a wave of cold sweats, dizziness, and spiraling thoughts. Even so, the unique properties of mad honey continue to intrigue people throughout the centuries. Its rarity only added to the mystique. Rhododendrons capable of creating this kind of honey weren't found everywhere. In fact, most edible honey comes from plants that produce no toxins at all. That made the honey from regions like Anatolia something of a prize. In small doses, it was seen as a tool for both physical and mental transformations, whether that meant easing chronic pain or experiencing a fleeting sense of otherworldly bliss. But for all its allure, mad honey was never something to be taken lightly, both figuratively and literally. Today, mad honey is more of a cultural curiosity than an everyday threat, though it's still harvested and sold in niche markets. It retains its reputation as a double-edged substance, alluring and dangerous, healing and harmful. Modern medicine has studied it more closely, identifying exactly how and why the grey anotoxins work, but science hasn't stripped away the mystery entirely. Even now, it's a reminder of how much power lies in the natural world and how careful humans have to be when they try to harness it. For medieval minds and even earlier societies, substances like mad honey were part of a broader human experience, the search for relief, escape, or transcendence. Whether it was treating an aching body or lifting the spirit to a higher plane, people turned to the natural world, often taking risks that seem unthinkable now. Mad honey was just one example of this ongoing dance between necessity, experimentation, and the unknown. Yet, for all its unpredictability, mad honey still felt intentional compared to the substances that seeped through medieval Europe by accident or superstition. While its effects varied wildly depending on dose and circumstance, at least those consuming it knew the risks, or could be taught to use it responsibly. Contrast that with the chaotic world of medieval Europe, where substances like henbane or mandrake blurred the lines between medicine and magic, or consider how ergot turned an everyday loaf of bread into a collective nightmare. Add to this the meticulous study of altered states in other cultures, and it becomes clear just how diverse these experiences were. Take hashish during the Islamic Golden Age, for example, where consumption wasn't a random or accidental event, but a deliberate path toward meaning or spirituality. While medieval Europeans wrestled with suspected curses and unpredictable side effects, hashish offered something entirely different. It represented a culture of intentional exploration, one where altered states weren't just feared or ridiculed, but studied and even celebrated. Let's explore how this substance, steeped in ritual and intellectual curiosity, shaped a more methodical approach to unlocking the mind. What if substances weren't just about numbing pain or causing chaos, but were tools for expanding the soul? For centuries, hashish played that exact role for certain mystics and thinkers during the Islamic Golden Age. While medieval Europe teetered between witchcraft accusations and unpredictable highs from rye bread or henbane, Islamic scholars, poets, and Sufi mystics approached altered states with care and intention. For them, hashish wasn't simply an escape. It was a bridge to the divine, a way to loosen the grip of ego and connect with something far beyond daily life. Hashish, derived from cannabis, wasn't exactly new to the region by the time of the Islamic Golden Age, which spanned roughly from the 8th to the 13th centuries. But the culture surrounding it took on a life of its own during this period. By extracting the resin from the cannabis plant and processing it into more concentrated forms, hashish offered effects ranging from peaceful introspection to euphoria. To the untrained eye, it may not have looked much different from a spice or herbal mixture, especially because it was often blended into pastes or snacks infused with honey and aromatic spices. These infusions weren't just practical for consumption. They also carried a ceremonial air, blending everyday ingredients with something extraordinary. Sufi mystics, in particular, embraced hashish as a tool for dissolving the ego and focusing the mind on spiritual truths. Their rituals emphasized contemplation, chanting, and repetitive movements, all designed to shift their mental state. Hashish fits seamlessly into that framework. By quieting the noise of daily life and creating a heightened sense of awareness, it offered an avenue to explore the divine. For the Sufis, this wasn't about indulgence or recklessness. Quite the opposite. It was about precision. They believed the effects of hashish could help them tear down the barriers that separated the individual self from God. In their writings, you can find poetic descriptions of transcendence, moments when the self dissolves into the universe or becomes one with the eternal. For them, the altered state wasn't just recreational, it was sacred. And hashish wasn't limited to mystics either. Poets and philosophers of the era began documenting its effects, mixing the spiritual with the intellectual. Persian poets, for example, explored the sensations and visions brought on by hashish, using its influence to shape their verses. Stories describe hashish's ability to conjure vivid imagery and foster creativity, inspiring works that often blurred the line between the real and the surreal. On the scientific side, scholars and early pharmacologists took a more technical interest. Manuscripts from figures like Ibn al-Baytar, a 13th century botanist, included descriptions of cannabis-derived substances, their effects on the body, and how they interacted with the mind. Remarkably, they approached these observations with curiosity rather than condemnation. In an age when trial and error was often the only path forward, the scientific community of this region sought to study hashish as part of a larger desire to understand human existence, both physical and spiritual. To understand why hashish held such a distinct role, it's important to consider its cultural context. Unlike the chaos surrounding henbane or ergot in medieval Europe, hashish was often handled with intention and control. It wasn't something left partly to chance or whispered about in fear. The Islamic Golden Age placed great value on knowledge, and while certain substances were debated, alcohol, for instance, was widely prohibited, the use of hashish wasn't met with universal opposition. Critics of hashish certainly existed, particularly those within religious or legal circles who feared it might lead to indulgence or distraction from religious duties. But even the criticisms tended to focus on abuse or excess, rather than the substance itself. Preparation was, unsurprisingly, part of this controlled approach. Hashish was rarely smoked outright in its raw form during this time. Instead, it was softened into edible formats, often combined with honey to counteract its bitter taste. Honey wasn't just a sweetener, though. It had its own historical connections to health and divinity, making the combination feel like both a treat and a medicine. For some, these honeyed pastes were part of social gatherings, enjoyed in moderation alongside poetry recitals or philosophical discussions. In other settings, especially among the Sufis, hashish consumption carried more ritualistic undertones. It wasn't something passively consumed, but actively integrated into practices of prayer, meditation, and reflection. Not every society under Islamic rule embraced hashish equally, but its role in spiritual and intellectual exploration couldn't be ignored. The way hashish was treated highlights a stark contrast between different approaches to mind-altering substances. In medieval Europe, the use of certain plants and compounds was drenched in fear and moral suspicion. Altered states were often interpreted as possessions, curses, or dark magic. Even when substances were used medicinally, their unpredictable nature made them easy scapegoats for accusations of wrongdoing. In Islamic culture during the Golden Age, however, hashish, while still controversial at times, occupied a more deliberate space. It was treated as an avenue for philosophical inquiry and self-discovery, as well as a means of deepening one's bond to the divine. There are stories about how hashish was adopted by certain Sufi mystics who sought to separate the spirit from ordinary distractions. These stories, sometimes filled with humorous or exaggerated elements, paint a picture of how entrenched hashish became in particular circles. Legends tell of mystics who, in moments of frustration, turned to hashish to calm their minds and found themselves overcome by enlightened clarity. In these tales, the hashish-inspired revelations always seem to flow effortlessly into teachings or parables, a reminder that even the altered state was meant to serve a higher purpose. This intentional relationship with hashish was supported by the broader intellectual climate of the time, which prized observation and experimentation. The Islamic Golden Age was marked by significant advances in science, medicine, astronomy, and the arts. Scholars like Al-Razi, known in Western circles as Razes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, bridged the gap between philosophy and medicine, examining the ways body and mind interacted. Substances like hashish found their way into these conversations, not only as curiosities, but as tools that could reveal something fundamental about human experience. If a plant could shift perception, what did that say about the mind's inner workings, or about the nature of reality itself? These were the kinds of questions that flourished in this environment, pushed forward by a cultural willingness to explore new ideas. That's not to say hashish use was universally accepted or without its controversies. Leaders and clerics occasionally condemned its misuse, likening its overuse to laziness or indulgence. However, its reputation as a tool for mystics and scholars tempered these criticisms. The key difference was intent. Using hashish to align yourself with divine truths or unlock creative brilliance was seen in a much kinder light than, say, using it frivolously. The line drawn was a fine one. Still, this distinction elevated hashish above the chaotic unpredictability of substances in medieval Europe. While an ergot-tainted loaf of bread could sink an entire town into convulsions, hashish use was largely intentional, studied, and spiritually framed. It wasn't just its effects, but the way it was woven into society that sets hashish apart. The emphasis on moderation, ritual, and knowledge gave it not just a role, but a purpose, situating it within a culture that valued balance. The goal wasn't mere escapism. It was transcendence, insight, or self-awareness. If we compare this to medieval Europe, where altered states were more often sources of fear and superstition, the Islamic world's perspective on hashish feels like a breath of fresh air. Its approach reminds us that the same substance can carry wildly different meanings depending on how it's contextualized. Even now, the legacy of hashish from this era lingers on. Its association with poetry, mysticism, and intellectual curiosity gives it historical depth that echoes beyond its substance. For those mystics and scholars, hashish represented an invitation to expand the mind rather than shut it down, to dissolve the barriers between the self and the divine, between one thought and the next. While medieval towns in Europe writhed in the chaos of ergot or henbane, hashish was quietly offering something different, a sense of direction within the altered state. This structured relationship with hashish highlights how cultural attitudes can transform even the simplest plant into something profound. It wasn't just about the substance, it was about the intention, the context, and the way it was woven into the intellectual and spiritual fabric of the time. It's a striking example of how a mindful approach to nature can foster both understanding and transcendence. But while hashish operated in deliberate and peaceful circles, not all mind-altering experiences came with such careful thought. Some were subtle, creeping in softly, almost unnoticeably, like the curls of incense burned in dimly lit religious ceremonies. What if the sweet, smoky air of sacred spaces wasn't just symbolic, but carried its own mood-altering effects? Let's see how the spirituality of incense shaped medieval consciousness. Have you ever sat in a quiet space filled with wafting streams of incense and noticed how it changes the air around you, or even how you feel? For medieval minds, the smell of burning incense was more than just a backdrop to prayer. It created an atmosphere of the divine, a sensory bridge between the earthly and the heavenly. But what if it wasn't just symbolic? What if that sweet-smelling smoke actually worked its way into the brain, nudging emotions, thoughts, and even physical states in subtle, unexpected ways? Incense was everywhere during the Middle Ages, especially in religious spaces. Whether you walked into a medieval cathedral, an Orthodox church, a mosque, or even a Buddhist temple, you'd likely be greeted by that familiar smoky aroma. Frankincense and myrrh were the staples, often ground into powders or resins and burnt on coals, releasing their fragrant, curling smoke into the air. These two substances, exotic and expensive, were deeply tied to symbols of sanctity and purity. Frankincense carried the metaphorical weight of prayers rising toward heaven, while myrrh, long associated with embalming the dead, spoke to the transience of life and the promise of the afterlife. As poetic as that all sounds, it turns out that incense might have been doing more than just representing abstract concepts. It may have physically changed how people experience these rituals. Let's be clear. Incense contains compounds that aren't just aromatic, but have actual effects on the body. When burned, resins like frankincense release boswellic acid, an anti-inflammatory compound that studies suggest might have mild effects on the brain's limbic system, the part that processes emotions and memories. Now, no one's saying medieval attendees left a service feeling fully medicated, but consider the environment. Dim lighting, softly chanting voices, and thickened air laced with what today might qualify as a mild psychoactive. Add hours of repetitive prayers or chanting to the mix, and suddenly, incense is no longer just a pleasant scent. It's setting the stage for something much deeper. You'd hardly realize it, but standing there in the flickering light, you might find yourself feeling calmer, more in tune with the surroundings, even more connected in a way that felt spiritual, but had a very physical trigger too. The length and intensity of medieval services meant these atmospheres were all-enveloping, sometimes bordering on overwhelming. Christian liturgies often stretched on for hours, filling the space with rhythmic chants that echoed against soaring stone arches. Incense was burned continuously, blanketing worshippers in a surreal fog that seemed to lift them up, if only inwardly. In mosques, while the use of incense wasn't essential to the ritual itself, it was still present, especially during important prayers or Friday gatherings. And over in Buddhist temples, incense burned steadily as monks meditated, creating a hypnotic rhythm of scent and silence, tying the body to the eternal present. Across these traditions, the smoke seemed to soften the edges of the here and now, drawing people into their respective spiritual journeys. But here's the curious thing. Nobody back then could have known why or how this worked. The church, for instance, didn't see incense as a mood-altering tool. They framed it as a sacred element, a physical representation of uplifted souls. The upward curl of the smoke mirrored the rising prayers of the congregation, forging a symbolic link between the physical and divine. Clerics claimed it purified the air, driving out evil spirits and preparing worshippers for spiritual engagement. The science behind smoke-altering brain chemistry, not exactly on their radar. Incense was sacred because it just was. Its effects were folded into larger spiritual narratives. And yet, what modern science has uncovered suggests that its effects weren't entirely incidental. Mild psychoactive changes, however subtle, were likely part of the sensory experience of these rituals. The boswellic acid in frankincense, for example, doesn't act like a modern drug. It isn't powerful enough to cause hallucinations or dramatic mind shifts, but it does seem capable of influencing emotion, creating a sense of calm or uplifting the spirit. The same brain activity that helps regulate stress or anxiety might have been gently nudged by the steady inhalation of incense smoke. Was it overwhelming? But in the context of hours-long religious rituals, even small shifts could have compounded into something that felt deeply profound. Take medieval cathedrals, for example. These spaces were already designed to overwhelm the senses, soaring ceilings, stained glass windows shooting colored light across the room, and the distant echo of chanted Latin prayers. Incense added yet another layer, subtly affecting heart rates and stress levels in a way most people would never connect to the smoke itself. The same likely applied in less elaborate settings. Even smaller parish churches burned frankincense during celebrations like Christmas or Easter, filling the air with its trademark sweetness. People came expecting to feel something transcendent, and incense helped deliver that feeling, even if no one understood the mechanics of why it seemed to work. A similar argument could be made for mosques. Though the use of incense was less ingrained in Islamic rituals, certain occasions, Friday prayers, the holy month of Ramadan, or the welcoming of esteemed visitors, were marked by burning fragrant resins and woods. These scents weren't just decorative. They carried cultural weight, presenting an atmosphere of purity and respect for sacred spaces. Worshipping in such a carefully curated environment likely affected people's emotional engagement with their prayers. It wasn't about zoning out into an incense-induced haze, but about sharpening their focus and centering the body in devotion. And if you shift even further east, Buddhist monks relied on incense for entirely different reasons. For them, the repetitive act of burning temple incense wasn't just about creating an atmosphere. It was a practice itself, woven directly into meditation. A swirling stick of sandalwood smoke wasn't just background decoration. It measured time, marking the rhythm of chants or silent contemplation. Here, the fragrance acted as an anchor, pulling wandering thoughts back to the moment. Add a mild psychoactive edge to this already deeply intentional practice, and it's no wonder incense played such a powerful part in spiritual frameworks across so many cultures. Of course, not everyone saw incense as mystical. Over time, there were critiques of how heavily it saturated sacred spaces. Some church reformers in the late medieval period began to view it as overly theatrical, distracting from the pure essence of prayer. But even those criticisms focused on its physical presence, the visible smoke, its earthy scent, not so much on any effect it might be having on the mind. What's interesting is how incense blurred the line between natural and otherworldly. No one would have thought to call it a mind-altering substance, yet it undeniably shaped the experience of worship. The distinction was subtle but important. This wasn't a deliberate, direct attempt to change one state of mind, as you might find with substances like hashish or henbane. Most worshippers wouldn't have even considered the possibility of incense affecting their physiology. Its role was woven seamlessly into the fabric of spiritual life, an unquestioned presence that, ironically, may have influenced perceptions more than people realized. Some might wonder whether this effect was purely accidental. Could medieval clergy have noticed incense's calming influence and leaned into it, or were they entirely unaware? It's a question that's hard to answer definitively. What we do know is that the symbolism of incense was rich enough on its own to justify its use, with or without any awareness of its subtle effects. Smoke was ephemeral yet present, material yet fleeting, a perfect mirror for the human spirit striving toward the divine. If those burning powders and resins also happened to nudge the brain toward tranquility or awe, it likely felt like an affirmation of incense's sacred quality, rather than a result of chemistry. The story of incense in the Middle Ages reflects a broader theme we've seen time and again: the unpredictability of altered states. Whether the cause was henbane, a loaf tainted with ergot, or a bowl of hashish-laced sweets, substances in the Middle Ages often walked a curious line between perceived intention and unseen chemistry. Incense slots neatly into this history, not as a wild hallucinogen or dangerous poison, but as a quiet influencer, shaping spiritual movements in subtle and lasting ways. And yet, for all its subtlety, incense was just one tool among many. As we've seen, medieval people turned to plants, ointments, recipes, and even mind-altering bread in their search for escape, clarity, or connection to the sacred. Each substance carried its own risks and mysteries, its own ability to blur the boundary between physical relief and spiritual experience. It was a world where even the most ordinary things, like the smell of burning resin or the bread on your table, could open doors to realities that felt far beyond the everyday. In medieval times, the need to escape wasn't so different from ours today, though their methods often came with far greater risks. From henbane's unpredictable visions to hashish's spiritual journeys, the search for relief, whether from pain, monotony, or reality itself, was universal. These substances reflected a deeper human truth, the need to feel something beyond the ordinary, and in a way, not much has changed. So as you turn off this video, think about how much of our modern world is still shaped by that same search for meaning, comfort, or connection. There's always more history tucked in the shadows.